Hey guys, tonight we are gently closing the door on the modern world and opening one onto the ancient, dusty, but eternally fascinating ruins of Rome. Picture this with me. You're not sitting at home. You are standing on the Palatine Hill in the late 4th century. The air is thick, not with pollution, but with the scent of wood smoke, old marble, and too many unwashed bodies. Below you, the Forum looks vast and impressive, sure, but you notice the cracks. The temples need new tiles, the roads are rutted from countless wagons, and the aqueducts, well, let's just say the water pressure isn't what it used to be. You see the legions marching out, their armor patched, their eyes tired. You might think this empire will last forever, that the sun will always shine on the city, but you'd be wrong. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen living in the West in the year 400 CE, you probably wouldn't survive the next 50 years with your life or property intact. The slow, grinding descent into collapse has already begun. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, let me know your location and what time it is for you right now in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're not talking about a sudden cataclysmic event like a meteorite strike or an alien invasion. The fall of Rome was 1,000 little cuts, and the very first one was simply that the empire was too successful and too big. Think about it. At its height under Trajan, the empire stretched from the damp hills of Scotland to the scorching deserts of Arabia. It was a staggering 5 million square kilometers. You, the emperor, are stuck in Rome, trying to micromanage the movement of troops in Dacia, the wheat supply in Egypt, and the tax collection in Gaul. This phenomenon, which historians call imperial overstretch, means that the cost of simply maintaining the empire began to exceed the benefit it provided. Let's look at the infrastructure, the arteries of Rome. You might focus on the roads, of which there were tens of thousands of miles, built so well that you can still see them today. But these roads required constant, back-breaking maintenance. Who pays for it? The local elite, the curiales. As the economy starts to wobble, these local bigwigs start to bail, dodging their civic duties. Soon, the roads become less reliable. A journey that once took 6 weeks now takes 2 months. This chokes trade, and a choked trade network means less money flowing back to the central government. The famous Roman efficiency is slowing to a crawl. Then there are the aqueducts. These were feats of engineering that brought clean water, a radical luxury for the ancient world, into cities. But in the late empire, you see lead pipes. Yes, the Romans knew about the dangers of lead, but it was easy to work with, needing replacement, or the delicate arches of the aqueducts collapsing due to earthquakes or simply neglect. When the water supply is disrupted, hygiene plummets, and that leads us nicely into the next point. But we have to stick to overstretch for a moment. The biggest drain on resources, however, was the military. By the 4th century, you need an army of around 400,000 men just to guard the extremely long, porous borders, the limes. This massive standing army is the single largest line item in the imperial budget. It's a necessary expense because without it, the empire vanishes overnight. But it's a paradox. The more money you spend on the army, the less you have for infrastructure, schools, and civic building, which are the very things that make Roman life worth defending. Historians still argue whether the empire collapsed because its military was too expensive or because, in the end, it became too weak, but the budgetary pressure was definitely the first domino. A quirky tidbit, just to lighten the mood. The Romans were incredibly meticulous about their army pay, but the supplies were often haphazard. When one emperor, Septimius Severus, famously told his sons to enrich the soldiers, scorn all other men, he was simply acknowledging that the army had become the only constituent that mattered. Everyone else was just there to feed the war machine. So you're standing on that hill, watching a heavily subsidized grain ship sail up the Tiber. You feel secure. But what you can't see are the ledgers in the imperial treasury, showing that the cost of governing Britain a cold, rebellious province on the edge of the world, is far outweighing the paltry tax revenue it generates. The vast size that was once Rome's greatest strength has become its most debilitating weakness. The administrative layers, the governors, the tax collectors, the legions, are all simply too distant, too corruptible, and too slow to respond to the myriad crises bubbling up simultaneously. The empire has become a huge, beautiful, but terminally ill dinosaur, consuming more energy just to stand up than it gets from eating. You can hear its heavy, tired breathing if you listen closely enough. We left you on the Palatine Hill, sensing the slow decay of the roads and the unbearable cost of the legions. But if a massive budget deficit was Rome's chronic illness, then the devastating plagues were the recurring, acute infections that nearly killed the patient outright. Tonight, we're going to step away from the dusty ledgers and look at a far more terrifying enemy, invisible pathogens that swept through the empire, sparing no one. We're moving into the era of the plague of Cyprian. Now you might think of the Black Death as the ultimate ancient pandemic, but centuries earlier, Rome was repeatedly hit by waves of infectious disease that fundamentally shattered the empire's social and economic fabric. The plague of Cyprian, which ravaged the empire from around 249 to 262 CE, didn't just kill people, it killed the Roman idea of itself. You see, the Romans prided themselves on their mastery over nature, their Pax Romana, which promised security and prosperity. But here was a foe they couldn't see, couldn't fight with a sword, and couldn't negotiate with. Imagine yourself in Alexandria, a bustling hub of trade and learning. You're watching the port, which is usually jammed with grain ships from Egypt, and suddenly it's quiet. The plague, likely smallpox or a similar hemorrhagic fever, is tearing through the city. Contemporary accounts from Bishop Cyprian himself describe the horrific symptoms: burning internal fire, bleeding in the throat, incessant vomiting, and blinding pain in the feet. A mainstream historical fact we often forget is that the sheer density of Roman cities and the efficiency of those glorious roads and sea lanes we mentioned in the last section acted as perfect superhighways for the disease. The same infrastructure that allowed wheat to flow quickly from Egypt to Rome now allowed the contagion to travel just as swiftly. The demographic disaster that followed was catastrophic. The best estimates suggest the plague killed thousands a day in Rome alone at its peak. Over its 13-year run, the Roman Empire's population may have dropped by a quarter, possibly even more in some urban centers. Think about the implications. Who is dying? Everyone, yes, but crucially, the young, the soldiers, the farmers, and the artisans. This immediately cripples the tax base. If a peasant family of 6 is reduced to a single survivor, the imperial tax collector gets a fraction of what he did before. Less tax revenue means less money for those demanding legions. It also decimates the army. Roman legions relied on constant recruitment of fresh, strong Italian or provincial men. After the plague, there simply aren't enough Romans left to fill the ranks. This is where a major shift happens. The empire is forced to increasingly rely on recruiting barbarians, the Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, to fight its wars. These foreign recruits were fiercely loyal to their commanders, often fellow barbarians, rather than to the distant, unseen emperor in Rome. This process of barbarization of the army, which starts here, is a slow poison that will prove fatal. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the height of this crisis, Roman society began to look for explanations. While the old pagan priests struggled and failed to contain the disease, a small, rapidly growing group was stepping up: Christians. They gained notoriety and new converts by tending to the sick, regardless of their own safety, a stark contrast to the pagan practice of abandoning the infected. This selfless act, rooted in their faith, provided comfort and, perhaps more importantly, an answer to the terrifying randomness of the disease, drastically accelerating the spread of Christianity, a force we'll analyze further down the line. The third impact is on the agricultural economy. With fewer hands to work the fields, vast tracts of land, especially in marginal provinces, were abandoned. Rome was a largely agrarian society. No farmers meant no food. No food meant starvation and inflation, which started the downward economic spiral that will become Section 4. Historians still argue whether Rome's collapse was primarily economic, military, or environmental, but the demographic collapse from the plagues put an immense, irreversible strain on all three sectors simultaneously. The empire became a hollow shell, a huge geographical entity with too few people to sustain its complex, high-maintenance lifestyle. When you think of the grand monuments of Rome, remember that many were built by a huge, thriving population that no longer existed by the 3rd and 4th centuries. You, the late Roman citizen, are now living in a world that is less populous, less prosperous, and significantly more dangerous than that of your grandparents. The sense of immutable stability is gone, replaced by a low-grade, persistent fear, and the distant, tired emperor is starting to look less like a god and more like a desperate man, frantically trying to plug a leaky dike with dwindling resources and fewer people left to help him. You can almost feel the chill wind blowing through the deserted alleyways of your once bustling city. In the last section, we saw the life draining out of the empire, thanks to the plagues, which left the army understaffed and the fields untended. Now, we turn to the fever dream years, the tumultuous period that historians call the 3rd century crisis, a time when the empire essentially ate itself alive from the inside out. If the plagues weakened the patient, this era was the violent seizure that put it in critical condition. Imagine yourself as a high-ranking official in Rome during the 250s CE. You wake up, and your first job is to find out who the emperor is today. Seriously, in the 50-year period between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had at least 26 recognized legitimate emperors and countless more who claimed the title, only to be murdered a few months later. That's an average reign of about 2 years. Try running a 5 million square kilometer empire when the person at the top keeps changing faster than the seasons. This is the age of the barracks emperors, or more formally, military anarchy. The core problem we identified earlier, the colossal, expensive army, now took over the political structure entirely. The legions, feeling underpaid, overworked, and increasingly distant from a weak central government, realized they had the ultimate power. They could simply declare their general the new emperor. And they did, repeatedly. Why did this happen? Because the empire was under simultaneous immense pressure on multiple fronts: the Sasanian Persians in the east, and the coalescing Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube. A competent general would score a victory. His soldiers would hoist him onto their shields and declare him Augustus, and he'd have to immediately march on Rome to fight the other general, who was also just declared emperor somewhere else, say, in Gaul or Syria. This created 3 devastating effects. First, constant civil war. The Roman legions, the most powerful fighting force in the world, were spending more time killing other Romans than fighting the actual enemies of the state. This drained manpower, wasted resources, and left key borders undefended. Second, the empire started to literally fracture. At its lowest point, the vast Roman state splintered into 3 separate rival entities: the Gallic Empire in the west, Gaul, Britain, and Spain; the Palmyrene Empire in the east, Syria, Egypt, parts of Asia Minor; and the traditional Roman emperor holding only Italy, Africa, and the Balkans. Historians still argue whether this fracturing was a sign of Rome's inherent weakness or an ingenious, temporary, localized defense strategy that ultimately kept the whole thing from dissolving completely, but in the moment, it felt like total dissolution. Third, and perhaps most crushingly, was the effect on the emperor's legitimacy. The position was no longer one of divine right or inherited authority. It was a revolving door secured only by the loyalty of the nearest, largest group of soldiers. This destroyed the public's faith in the government's stability and its ability to protect them. Why pay taxes to an emperor who will be dead by Christmas? Here's a quirky tidbit to show you how insane things got. One of the more successful barracks emperors, Aurelian, earned the nickname Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, because he managed, against all odds, to crush the Gallic and Palmyrene empires and briefly reunite the whole thing. But what was the first thing he had to do when he got back to Rome? He had to build the massive Aurelian walls around the city, a recognition that for the first time in centuries, Rome itself was vulnerable to direct barbarian attack. The capital of the world needed a colossal physical defense, a clear admission that the limes, the borders, were failing. A mainstream historical fact: the sheer financial cost of this instability was astronomical. Every new emperor would pay a huge cash bonus, called a donativum, to the soldiers who backed him. This was a form of legalized bribery, and it was ruinously expensive. Where did the money come from? It came from the imperial treasury, which was now empty, leading us directly into the massive economic crisis of the next section. You, the citizen, feel totally abandoned. You now rely on local landowners for protection, forming the nascent feudal-like structures that will characterize the post-Roman West. The emperor is a distant figure of fear and ridicule, and the legions are as likely to plunder your farm as they are to defend it. The grand, unified vision of the Roman state has been replaced by localized chaos, warlordism, and a desperate struggle for survival. The mighty engine of empire is not just stalled, it's on fire, and every aspiring general is pouring gasoline on it for a chance at the helm. You can hear the distant, terrifying tramp of marching boots. You just don't know if they're coming to save you or to kill your emperor. We've traversed the vast, ungovernable stretches of the empire and survived the deadly plagues and the political chaos of the barracks emperors. But all that instability had one very tangible, destructive consequence that affected every single person, from the emperor to the lowliest peasant: economic devaluation and hyperinflation. Now, you are going to feel the slow, insidious death of money itself, the destruction of trust in the very coin you hold in your hand. Imagine you are a merchant in Ostia, the port of Rome, around 260 CE. You want to sell a barrel of olive oil. Normally, you'd expect a certain amount of silver coins, the denarii. But the money in your pouch feels light, and it's no longer shining silver. It's a dull, coppery color. That's because the emperors, desperate for cash to pay the donativa, those massive bribes to the troops we talked about in the last section, and to fund their constant civil wars, started engaging in a practice called coin debasement. This is how it worked. A silver coin was supposed to be, say, 90% pure silver. The emperor, needing to mint 100 coins but only having enough silver for 50, decided to melt down the existing coins, take out some silver, and replace it with cheaper base metals like copper or tin. He could then stretch his supply to mint 100 coins that looked like silver, but were actually only 50% silver. He's essentially creating money out of thin air, but decreasing the intrinsic value of every single coin in circulation. In the early empire, the denarius was about 90% silver. By the end of the 3rd century crisis, the key Roman coin, the Antoninianus, was often less than 2% silver, sometimes barely a wash of silver over a copper core. A mainstream historical fact: this extreme debasement is the physical evidence of Rome's desperation. The coin had become nearly worthless, and the state had become a pathological liar. The result? Hyperinflation. The laws of economics are cruel. If the same number of coins now have far less real value, prices must shoot up. If the government is giving you a copper slug for your silver coin, you, the farmer, will demand 10 slugs for your bushel of grain instead of 1. The military officers, whose loyalty the emperors desperately needed, were often the first to realize the coins were useless. They started demanding to be paid in kind, in food, clothing, weapons, or most critically, land. This shift completely broke the fragile cash-based economy that had once fueled the empire's vast trade networks. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Romans tried to stop this with price controls. Emperor Diocletian, a reformer we'll meet later, issued the edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, setting a fixed price for nearly every good and service, from a pound of pork to the cost of a scribal lesson. and decreed the death penalty for violators. Did it work? Absolutely not. Merchants simply hoarded goods or moved to the black market, making shortages even worse. The law of supply and demand, it turns out, is stronger than imperial decree. This inflation had two critical long-term effects. First, the urban centers died. Cities thrived on trade and a stable currency. When the currency collapsed, trade dried up. Wealthy citizens fled the cities to their self-sufficient country estates, villas, taking their money and influence with them. The cities, which were the heart of Roman civilization, began to physically shrink. Second, the relationship between the state and the people became predatory. The imperial government realized that collecting taxes in worthless coins was pointless. They shifted to collecting taxes in kind, grain, oil, textiles, or more oppressively, demanding citizens provide forced labor or services, a kind of proto-serfdom. You, the citizen, might be forbidden from leaving your trade or your farm because the state needed you to produce a specific good or fulfill a specific military quota. The vibrant, free Roman citizen was rapidly being replaced by the shackled, duty-bound subject. Historians still argue whether the hyperinflation was the cause of the economic decline or merely a symptom of the political anarchy, but the outcome was the same. The central mechanism that funded the empire was destroyed. The gold and silver that had been the foundation of the economy flowed steadily out to pay for luxury goods, like silk from China, and into the hands of barbarian mercenaries, but it was not being replenished. You are now a citizen in an empire where your savings are worthless, your children are potentially forced into their father's trade, and the emperor's promise on a coin is a lie. The financial glue that held the vast, complex machine together has dissolved, leaving you clinging to the hope of a good harvest, not the promise of a powerful state. We've traced the economic ruin that started with the barracks emperors debasing the coinage. But as the silver content of the denarius was melting away, a different kind of value system, a new way of thinking, was solidifying in the hearts and minds of the empire's population. Tonight, we look at the quiet, profound revolution that was the rise of Christianity and its impact on traditional Roman civic life and imperial loyalty. Imagine you are living in the year 350 CE. Your grandparents were still offering sacrifices to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. They believed that the gods guaranteed the success of the Roman state, the Pax Deorum, peace of the gods. But you, like an increasing number of your neighbors, go to a different kind of gathering, one focused not on civic duty and imperial power, but on personal salvation and moral community. Christianity, which started as a tiny, persecuted sect, had undergone a massive transformation. Remember that quirky tidbit from the plague section? The Christians' willingness to care for the sick when others fled made them stand out. This radical emphasis on charity and community was intensely attractive in an increasingly brutal, unstable world where the state offered very little protection or hope. If the Roman state couldn't guarantee you security in this life, Christianity promised a glorious reward in the next. The crucial turning point, a mainstream historical fact, was the conversion of Emperor Constantine the Great in the early 4th century. After his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he legalized Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. Suddenly, the faith of the martyrs became the faith of the elite. Within a century, under Theodosius I, it became the state religion, and paganism was effectively outlawed. This shift was a cultural earthquake. Roman identity had always been tied to public life, participating in civic cults, serving the state, and venerating the emperor as a divine figure, or at least a representative of the gods. The new Christian identity was transnational and focused inward. A Christian's primary loyalty was to God and the Church, not necessarily to the local governor or the distant, often immoral, emperor. Think about the implications for the military. The traditional Roman soldier fought for Roma, for the glory of the legions, and the protection of his ancestral gods. Christian ethics, particularly the emphasis on peace and the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," introduced a profound internal conflict for many. Historians still argue whether the pacifist elements of Christianity significantly reduced the fighting spirit of the legions, but it undeniably diverted the intellectual and spiritual energies of the Roman elite away from aggressive statecraft and toward theological debates and the building of magnificent churches. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the most visible effects was on the calendar and public spectacles. The riotous, bloody gladiatorial games, once a core element of Roman civic life and a way for emperors to distract the masses, were gradually suppressed by Christian emperors who found them morally repugnant. While they faded slowly, the end of this public bloodlust signaled a deep shift in Roman values, away from the brutal pragmatism of the battlefield and arena and toward contemplation and salvation. The Church also began to replace the state in providing social services. When the imperial bureaucracy failed to deliver food or basic security, a failure we saw in the inflation section, the bishops stepped up. They organized grain distribution, managed charitable funds, and even negotiated with invading barbarians when the local governor fled. In the chaotic late West, the local bishop often became the most powerful, most stable, and most respected figure in town. You, the citizen, now look to your bishop for help, not the tax collector. The empire is no longer a glorious, unifying idea. It's a harsh machine demanding your taxes and service. The Church, however, offers hope, community, and a spiritual purpose that transcends the crumbling, earthly state. This profound psychological shift meant that when the political structure of the Western Empire finally dissolved, most people felt sorrow, yes, but not the existential despair they might have felt centuries earlier. They already had a new, robust structure, the Church, to catch them. The spiritual foundation of Rome had been replaced long before the political one finally crumbled. We've seen the soul of the empire change as Christianity took hold, shifting loyalty from the pagan state to the transcendent Church. Now, let's look at the external pressures on the empire, the so-called barbarian invasions. But we need to update that word. It was less of an invasion and more a massive, desperate migration that strained the empire to the breaking point. Imagine standing guard on the Danube frontier in 370 CE. You've been trained your entire life to defend this riverline against raiding tribes. But what you see now isn't a small group of warriors looking for loot. It's a massive, frightened flood of people, men, women, children, livestock, and wagons, all fleeing for their lives. They aren't trying to conquer Rome, they are begging to be let in. The true catalyst for this mass movement was the arrival of the Huns from the east. The Huns were terrifying, nomadic horse archers whose speed and brutality pushed the entire structure of Central and Eastern Europe westward. The groups directly in their path, most notably the Goths, had a choice: be annihilated by the Huns or ask the Romans for sanctuary. The Goths pleaded with Emperor Valens to let them cross the Danube and settle inside the empire. This was not unprecedented. Rome had been recruiting and settling allied tribes, foederati, for centuries. It was a calculated risk. Rome got new farmers and, more importantly, a fresh supply of soldiers. The Goths got a chance to live. The problem wasn't the policy, it was the execution. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Roman officials responsible for settling the Goths were catastrophically corrupt and incompetent. Instead of being welcomed and provisioned, the Goths were subjected to horrific exploitation. Corrupt commanders, remember, the political system is still reeling from the 3rd century crisis we discussed earlier, sold them rotten food at exorbitant prices, effectively enslaving them. Here's a quirky tidbit that demonstrates the depth of this depravity. Roman officials were so greedy that they reportedly demanded the Goths hand over their own children into slavery in exchange for a meager supply of dog meat, because the price of a slave could buy a few pounds of the required grain. The Goths, starving and humiliated, quickly realized that the empire they had begged to join was just as dangerous as the Huns they had fled. They revolted. This was not a foreign war, it was a desperate internal rebellion. The Goths quickly transformed from potential allies and settlers into a rogue army roaming the Balkans. This put intolerable border pressure on the already overstretched legions, as we covered in Section 1. The Goths had to be fought, which meant pulling troops from other borders, leaving those areas undefended and inviting other groups, Franks, Vandals, Suebi, to cross the Rhine and Danube into the vulnerable western provinces. Historians still argue whether the Western Empire fell due to the sheer volume of external pressure or its own administrative failure to integrate these groups, but the Goths' rebellion certainly proves the latter. Rome's system had become too brittle, too corrupt, and too focused on short-term gain to handle the long-term project of mass assimilation. You, a citizen in Italy, hear about this Gothic rebellion not as a distant conflict, but as a local terror. The Roman field armies are busy fighting a group that should have been their allies, and meanwhile, the borders are wide open. The Federati, the barbarian troops who did remain loyal, were now fighting their own kin, further blurring the lines between defender and invader. The empire had lost control of the narrative, the borders, and the loyalty of its own administrative class. The slow, grinding collapse we discussed in earlier sections is now accelerating into a rapid, terrifying spiral. The pressure is coming from everywhere, and the empire is too internally fragile to hold its shape. The desperate migration of the Goths, fueled by the Huns and mishandled by corrupt Roman officials, brought us to a breaking point. Now we must turn our attention back to the Roman who tried hardest to stop the slide into chaos, Diocletian. He wasn't the last emperor, but his dramatic, centralizing reforms inadvertently accelerated the collapse of the western half while saving the east. Imagine it's the late 3rd century. The chaos of the 3rd century crisis, the 26 emperors in 50 years, the civil wars, the hyperinflation, has left the empire a shell. Diocletian, a shrewd and pragmatic general, recognized that one man could no longer effectively govern such a colossal, multi-front territory. His solution was brilliant in theory, the tetrarchy, or rule by 4. He essentially divided the empire into east and west, appointing 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesares. This was designed to ensure smoother succession. The Caesares would become the new Augusti, and, crucially, to allow imperial attention to be physically present at 4 different hotspots simultaneously. A mainstream historical fact, this formal division of the empire was the first irreversible separation that would eventually see the Western Empire vanish, while the Eastern, Byzantine Empire endured for another 1,000 years. Diocletian also implemented vast, intensive bureaucratic burdens to control the economy and stabilize the state. Remember the fleeing taxpayers and the collapsing currency? Diocletian tried to lock society into place. He fixed prices, which failed as we saw, tied farmers to the land, colony, and even made professions hereditary. You had to be what your father was. This massive centralization of power and the expansion of the bureaucracy meant a huge increase in the number of officials and, crucially, a need for a vastly more effective and efficient tax collection system. Here's the rub, the fundamental flaw that doomed the West. The 2 halves of the empire were not equal. The East was ancient, rich, urbanized, and densely populated, Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant. It had the stronger economy, the stable tax base, and far less intense barbarian pressure. The West, Gaul, Britain, Spain, Italy, was less populous, less urbanized, and bore the brunt of almost all the major barbarian incursions. Remember the Goths in the previous section? Diocletian's intensely rigid tax system, which demanded the same bureaucratic efficiency and resources from both sides, became an unbearable bureaucratic burden on the West. Because the West had fewer resources and lower population density, the taxes were far harder to collect, leading to higher rates of corruption and revolt. The Western bureaucracy became a huge, self-serving, inefficient beast that consumed the very resources it was supposed to protect. A quirky tidbit: Diocletian wasn't just obsessed with administration, he was obsessed with his own divine status. He adopted the title Iovius, like Jupiter, and introduced elaborate court rituals, requiring subjects to prostrate themselves before him, adoratio. This was a deliberate effort to restore the emperor's lost prestige after the chaos of the barracks emperors, but it further distanced the emperor from his people, making him seem even more remote and less accessible when crisis struck. Historians still argue whether Diocletian's reforms were a necessary evil that delayed the collapse, or a toxic over-centralization that killed the patient by destroying civic freedom and local initiative. But what's undeniable is that by splitting the empire and giving the wealthier, safer East its own court, armies, and treasuries, he essentially unshackled the East from the West's dying economy. The East could survive the coming storms. The West, hobbled by its weaker economy and disproportionate border defense costs, could not. The division, intended to save the whole, guaranteed the eventual loss of half. You can almost hear the sigh of relief coming from the marble halls of Constantinople, the new capital of the East, knowing they no longer had to bail out their impoverished Western cousin. In the last section, we saw the fateful permanent division of the Roman world by Diocletian, a move that gave the East a fighting chance while saddling the West with an unsustainable bureaucratic machine and a poor economy. Now we arrive at the pivotal military moment that validated the corruption and weakness we've been tracking, the crushing Roman defeat at the Battle of Adrianople. This wasn't just a lost battle, it was a devastating indictment of the late empire's entire strategic, economic, and political structure. Recall the Goths, who were starving, enslaved, and eventually driven to revolt by criminally corrupt Roman officials, a problem we discussed in Section 6. By 378 CE, this Gothic force was no longer a disorganized mob. It was a hardened, vengeful army moving through the Roman Balkans. Emperor Valens of the Eastern Empire, eager for military glory, and perhaps mistrustful of his Western counterpart Gratian, decided to personally lead an army to crush them near the city of Adrianople, modern Edirne, Turkey. Imagine the scene. It's a sweltering August day. Valens, reportedly impatient and confident, refused to wait for the arrival of Gratian's reinforcing troops from the west. He marched his tired legions directly into battle against a Gothic army bolstered by cavalry. The mainstream historical fact is that the Goths, under their leader Fritigern, utterly routed the Roman forces. The defeat was unprecedented. The emperor himself, Valens, was killed in the battle, an event that hadn't happened in Roman warfare for centuries. The true significance of Adrianople wasn't the body count, but the quality of those lost. The core of the Eastern Empire's best, most experienced and highly trained field army, the comitatenses, was annihilated. These were the professional soldiers, the backbone of the state's defense, and they could not be easily replaced. The demographic disaster from the plagues, Section 2, meant that Rome simply didn't have the population reserves to refill the ranks with high-quality, long-serving citizens. This defeat forced a humiliating realization on the empire. The Romans could no longer defeat the barbarians in a pitched, decisive battle. The new strategy, championed by Valens' successor Theodosius III, was one of appeasement and failed integration. Theodosius was forced to make a treaty with the Goths, settling them as an autonomous political entity inside the empire's borders. They were granted land and paid subsidies. Remember the never-ending financial drain from Section 4? But they retained their own commanders and laws, essentially becoming a state within a state. Historians still argue whether Theodosius's treaty was a pragmatic masterpiece that bought Rome time or a fatal concession that guaranteed the failure of Roman sovereignty in the West. The result was certainly catastrophic for the West. It set a terrible precedent. External groups could now gain land and power inside Roman territory, not by assimilation, but by violence. A quirky tidbit that encapsulates the mood: the famous Bishop Ambrose of Milan reportedly refused to administer communion to Emperor Theodosius until the emperor had repented for a massacre he ordered later in his reign, showcasing the massive moral authority the Church, Section 5, now held over the emperor, further diminishing the imperial office's traditional secular power. The Goths, now legally settled, soon grew restless, and under their great king Alaric, began to move westward, becoming the single most destructive force in the empire. It was these very people who Rome failed to integrate after Adrianople who would eventually breach the nearly 800 years of invincibility and sack Rome itself in 410 CE. This event, born directly out of the failures at Adrianople and the corruption that preceded it, didn't end the empire, but it psychologically shattered the Roman world's sense of permanence. You, the late Roman citizen, would remember the day the eternal city fell as the moment you realized that your glorious civilization was, in fact, terrifyingly mortal. The center could no longer hold. The catastrophic defeat at Adrianople and the failed integration of the Goths set the stage for the final, slow, and strangely quiet death of the Western Roman Empire. We have traced the many systemic failures, from overstretch and plague to economic collapse and political fracturing, and now we focus on the final shocks that brought the ancient world to its symbolic close. Imagine yourself huddled in a small, shrinking city in Gaul in the year 450 CE. The borders are gone. You haven't seen an imperial tax collector in years, but you've certainly seen the Vandals, the Visigoths, and the Burgundians, all powerful, organized kingdoms operating on former Roman soil. You are living in a patchwork quilt of successor states, most of whom claim to rule in the name of the Roman Empire, even as they carve up its territory. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric's Visigoths, which grew out of the Adrianople failure, was the first great shock. A second, equally devastating one came from the Vandals, who, after migrating across Gaul and Spain, established a powerful, hostile kingdom in North Africa. A mainstream historical fact is that this was a death blow to the West. North Africa was the grain basket that fed Rome and Italy, the crucial lifeline we mentioned in Section 1. With the Vandals controlling it, the city of Rome was permanently deprived of its reliable food supply and its main source of revenue, leading to chronic famine and economic stagnation. When the Vandals sacked Rome in 455 CE, it was even more brutal than the Visigothic sack. The Western Empire, now reduced to little more than Italy and parts of Gaul, was kept alive only by a handful of powerful Romanized Germanic generals like Stilicho and Ricimer. These men held the real power, making and unmaking puppet emperors at will. The emperors in Ravenna, the new safer capital, remember Rome itself was too vulnerable after the Aurelian walls, were shadows, often children, who existed only to sign decrees handed to them by the military strongmen. Historians still argue whether the empire ended due to a foreign invasion or whether it was simply taken over from the inside by its own Germanic generals. The death knell was less a crash and more a gentle sigh. The final curtain call came in 476 CE. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, the leader of the foederati army in Italy, had grown tired of the charade. When the current puppet emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, a name dripping with irony, combining the name of Rome's founder with its first emperor only in its diminutive little form, failed to pay his troops, Odoacer did not appoint a new puppet. He simply deposed Romulus, sending him into retirement with a small pension. A quirky tidbit is that this final emperor's life ended not in murder or battle, but in the quiet comfort of a villa. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He didn't even claim the title of Augustus. Instead, he took the Western imperial regalia, the crown, the purple robes, the symbols of office, and sent them to the one true emperor still standing, Zeno, in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Empire, which was safe thanks to Diocletian's division. His message was clear. There was no longer any need for a separate Western emperor. Odoacer simply styled himself as the King of Italy, ruling nominally under the authority of the Eastern Emperor. The Roman Empire in the West didn't so much collapse as it gently dissolved, its administration simply ceasing to function. The final authority for a Roman citizen no longer came from a Roman emperor on Western soil, but from the local Germanic king, who preserved elements of Roman law, language, and culture because they were still useful. You, the citizen in 480 CE, might not even notice the change. You are still struggling with inflation, Section 4, still praying in a Christian church, Section 5, and still trying to appease a Germanic warlord for protection. The state apparatus has vanished, replaced by a Germanic military aristocracy that is slowly adopting Roman ways. It was not a violent end, but a quiet, almost embarrassing managerial failure, a final surrender to centuries of internal rot. The name of Rome lives on, but the power, the system, and the glory have faded into the dust. Now, as the final echo of Romulus Augustulus's quiet retirement fades, allow your own mind to gently disengage from the dust and clamor of the ancient world. You are no longer on the Palatine Hill, but back in the soft security of your own space. Take a slow, deep breath, letting the worries of legions and taxes drift away like smoke. The grand narrative of collapse is finished, and what remains is the simple knowledge that all great structures, no matter how magnificent, eventually yield to time, to neglect, and to the endless movement of history. Think of the old stones of the Forum, how they survived even as the complex systems they once supported crumbled. The roads are still there, the ghostly outlines of the aqueducts still stretch across the countryside, and in their enduring silence, you can feel the immense gravity of the past. The fall of Rome wasn't an ending. It was a slow, deliberate transformation, a shift from one world to another, a transition that was confusing and difficult for those who lived it, but which ultimately led to the world we know today. Let that sense of endless change settle over you, knowing that even in dissolution, there is continuity. Allow your muscles to relax fully. You have traversed centuries of war, plague, and political intrigue tonight, and now it is time for rest. Let your eyelids grow heavy.